Hello and welcome back. So this type of video was requested by a few of you in the comments section. I shied away from it for a little while just because I think it's imperative that you have a draft strategy for your defensemen, and that strategy should absolutely be tailored to your league format, and most league formats are different, and thus people will have different needs on defense. But with the season drawing closer, there are clear delineations in these mock drafts in terms of where these D are being selected, and I wanted to at least cover the first two chunks of D and then address the situation for your D3 and D4 options. So, just as an introduction, this tiers list will obviously depend on your league format. This is tailored more towards a head-to-head categories league as that's the most popular. It can be useful for roto leagues and points leagues as well, but you will need to adapt this list to fit your league format, and that should be part of your strategy as you head into your draft. Now, you definitely need a strategy for your defensemen, and that strategy should depend on league format. So, for example, in my head-to-head categories league with hits and blocks, the tier lists are a little bit different. This is actually kind of what you're going to see here for that list with the hits and blocks D4 coverage. But as you know, I was talking to a couple of other people doing some analysis for them, and points leagues are a little bit different. If your league has different weighting for shots, hits, and blocks and whatnot, you could potentially have a completely different style that you're going to go for your drafting defensemen. So it definitely depends on your league format. With that said, the D1 and D2 tiers are more defined. The D3 lists are more ambiguous and subject to your league format. So the names you'll see at the top of the list, that's pretty much where they're going to go, and that's pretty much how you can rank them if you're following, a lot of the stuff that I've been talking about here on the channel. But some of the more ambiguous files, some of the more risky files, we'll get into that, are the D3, D4 options. But yeah, you can, if I missed somebody, odds are I did take a look at them, but just ran out of room. But if you have somebody that I clearly missed, you can leave that in the comments section, because any information is good information if we're all on the same page there. So as we start with the Elite D1 tier, it's important to note that each tier will be sorted left to right according to current Yahoo ADP, except for the hits and blocks D tier, which is sorted by proficiency with both category coverage for hits and blocks. So the hits and blocks is a little bit different, but as we start here left to right, that's the ADP for the tier. So in this tier, no surprises, Makar ADP 5.5, Hedman ADP 14.5, Fox ADP 17.1, and Josi ADP 20.5. And of the four of them, I'd prefer to get Josi at that ADP, though earlier in this mock season, Josi was going in the first round as the second D off the board. So just know that you won't be able to rely on one of these D being there at the tail end of the second round or the early part of the third round. So for example, if you have the first or second pick overall and you're looking at the next two picks that you have lined up, they will probably be in the late teens, early 20s, depending on league size. You will likely not have a chance to draft one of these guys. If you do, you jump on it right away, as these four guys are the top guys in the league. There is one little caveat to that, and I'll come back to that in a little bit, but these are the top four guys off the board. Now, there are a little bit of differences in some of these guys. Now, they're all elite. Makar is going to get you elite goal coverage, 28 goals last year. Josi had 23 goals. Hedman was in that high teens range. Fox doesn't get the goals or the shots. So he had 2.02 shots per game. He doesn't hit much, 0.38 hits per game. He does get 1.64 blocks, so he's not irrelevant there. But that's two fewer categories than, say, Josi, who averaged 1.5 shots per game more than Adam Fox, was just as prolific on the power play. He had more goal totals last year. He was second in the league in that category, and slightly more hits coverage as well at a 0.825, even though that's not targetable. But the same number of blocks, 1.6 blocks per game. So of the two, you would probably rather have Josi, and that's kind of what has been happening in the mock drafts. It's just a little bit different. As you get towards that ADP range, it's not a lot separating the two of them, 17 and 20 respectively, 17.1 for Fox and 20.5 ADP for Roman Josi. Now, I flipped these two guys because of what I just mentioned. So the shot volume and the goal totals and everything else, I flipped Josi and had him ahead of Fox. Normally the ADPs would have them switched, but just because of those factors, I would personally choose Josi over Fox, despite my own personal bias towards Fox. I still think Josi should have won the MVP last year. He was outstanding. But that decision between Fox and Josi should be the only one that you have to make in this range, though, because most of the D, or all of these D in this elite D1 tier, they're all going to be off the board by pick number 20. So you're probably not going to have to make too much of a decision. If you want Cale Makar, you got to pay a price to get him. If you want one of these two guys, you're probably looking at them at the end of the first or the beginning of the second round. You're probably going to get them if you're picking in the middle of your draft, in that 4 to 8 range. If you're picking at the front end, you're probably not going to get one of these guys as your D1. But for that purpose, you can potentially look at this list, and there's not a lot to differentiate some of these guys. So if you look at Fox, 0.94 point per game last year. If you look at Ekblad, 0.93, very close. And if you look at their files, Ekblad may actually cover some more categories than Adam Fox. Adam Fox is elite in terms of power play production, assist totals, and he's got some excellent exposure on the Rangers. But if you look at Ekblad, he covers more categories. The difference here is the ADP. So Fox is at 17.1, Ekblad is at 34.4. So you get a lot more value out of Aaron Ekblad. So if you do pick at the front end of the draft, first, second, third pick or whatever, you're likely going to get one of these guys as your D1. So, factor that in to your plan if you're, in that range, that you're not going to get one of these elite D1s, but you can get another, half a step notch down and get Ekblad or John Carlson. Now, the other thing about Adam Fox that I haven't really mentioned yet is he had an increase in production from his Norris Trophy season to last year, and he still was the fifth, was it fourth or fifth? I think he was the fourth highest point per game defenseman last year at 0.94. So he did better than what he did in his Norris Trophy season, and he's been trending up every season. So that's kind of why he's in this elite tier. He's been trending up at a 0.15 to 0.2 point per game difference between each year. So he's still growing and going in the right direction, and that's probably why he's up here. But if you look at these two D, Ekblad and Carlson, I've compared them in a very recent video I did. They're almost identical defensemen. The only main difference is the shots at 2.95 for Ekblad, 2.45 for Carlson, and the plus minus was a plus 35 for Ekblad and high teens for Carlson. So, I covered that in the mock draft 4 video if you want more clarity on that. But very similar defensemen. I'd be happy to grab either one of them with my D1 if I was picking in that first 3 picks range. Now again, this is sorted by ADP, so Seider will be the next one here, and he's definitely more of a category coverage play than an elite power play guy for me. And he's being drafted too high for my taste, and that is a case of his category coverage and his name value after an excellent rookie season last year. But let's take a look at some of the D around him. And would you prefer any of these guys over Seider? So he's being, targeted for his category coverage. But if you look at the file, only 0.60 point per game, much lower than the other guys in this tier. Goal coverage isn't great with 0.08 goal per game average for 7 goals on the year. And he was a -9 last year, which is a little bit cut off at the bottom. I'm not sure exactly why that is, but he did have a -9. That was the lowest of the group. And then on top of that, his power play numbers are good. They're just not elite level. They are a little bit below some of these other guys. I would expect some of these other guys to have more of a bounce, like a Letang and Riley. Riley on that elite power play unit, I would expect him to be able to maintain that or maybe take a bump from that. Quinn Hughes, he's obviously the best of the bunch here on the power play. Letang, I would also think with Malkin, Crosby, Gensel, etc., on that unit, he could potentially keep that up or take a bounce from that. And Seider could take a bounce from that as they just brought in a couple more players that could potentially help that power play. But thus far, his production is the lowest of the group at 0.25 with 21 power play points, but nothing crazy there. Now, what you would target him for is the hits and the blocks. 1.84 hits, 1.96 blocks. The blocks number is the highest of this group. But none of these guys, other than Quinn Hughes doesn't get any of this coverage, but Letang has more hits, and the blocks numbers aren't bad. 1.56 blocks per game. That's not that much different than this 1.96. Riley kind of covers both at around the same rate, nothing crazy there, but a little bit safer in some of the other categories as well. If you're looking at shots, Letang 2.74 shots per game, plus this hits number and the goals number he tied for goals. So he's a decent option if you're looking for these types of category coverages, and you wouldn't have necessarily expected that 2.19 hits per game being higher than Seider. So he does get different category coverage, and he was a plus 20, so he is a little bit better for that as well. The only main problem with him is staying healthy, and that's been his problem over the last number of years. That's been a problem in Pittsburgh, but last year he played 78 games, so he was relatively healthy, and there's nothing nagging leading him into this season. So as you're comparing these defensemen, again, it's crucial that you understand your league format and how to adjust your D strategy for that format. If you have a heavy goal weighting, maybe you're going to want to target Riley or Letang here, but if you have hits and blocks, maybe you want Letang or Seider. If you're looking for more production on the power play with more assist coverage, you would probably go with Quinn Hughes. If you're looking for shots and plus minus, maybe Letang or Riley. It really all does depend on what you're trying to accomplish with your D2 pick. And if you follow my data draft strategy, you're going to want a power play quarterback, which all four of these guys are, but the differentiating factor between them will depend on that league format. So in a head-to-head categories league, I'm fading Seider for a few reasons. One, the point ceiling is much lower than these other 3D, though he could improve on that rookie season, and I would definitely expect that from him. Number two, there isn't a proven track record, and in the top 6 rounds, I want safer picks, and I'm more averse to risk in that range. So just because there's not a lot of file on him, there's only that 1 year of data. There is a potential for a sophomore slump, a potential regression. Usually defensemen in the first 3 or 4 years of their career, they have a down year. Last year was certainly not a down year for Seider, so it could be any one of the next 3 years for him. The third reason, if I'm targeting a guy for peripherals, I'd go with Letang here. With more hits, only 0.4 fewer blocks per game, a more potent power play when healthy, and a consistent track record of production and shot production as well. And on top of all that, the goals, assists, points, totals, and per game numbers are higher, and his plus minus is a significant factor if you have that as a category as well. Obviously, his injury history would be the main concern there, but at ADP 59.5 as your D2, that could potentially be a better value play. If you wanted a safer option, Morgan Riley at 54.9 ADP could be better value as well. Seider is currently going, see if I have this in my notes, I believe he's in the 4th round at around the 41 range ADP. So that would be another reason to kind of fade him a little bit. It's just a little bit high considering that all these guys have, so 45.3 ADP in the 4th round. If I don't get Letang and I still want hits and blocks coverage, I jump on Radko Gudas a bit earlier in the 9th or 10th round, as opposed to jumping on Seider in the 4th round range at ADP 45.3. So, in that range, you're looking, if you're following the data draft strategy, you want a power play quarterback who's going to get you some elite category coverage. Now, the only thing that he led in was blocks per game of these 4D. I could see a bump from a lot of these stats, but at the same time, there's just a little bit too much risk there for me trying to go with a younger player in that range. Now, I'm not saying I'm expecting a drop in production from Seider. I would expect a bump in production closer to that 0.8 point per game range, maybe an increase in plus minus and goal coverage as well. But for me, these guys are better options, safer options in that range for your draft. So as we return to the list here, we have a new look here, the good D2s or the elite D3s. So as we start here, Devon Toews was the next highest ADP guy. He's the major problem with him is that he doesn't quarterback that power play, but what he does do is put up points and score goals as well, with 13 goals last year, 0.16 goal per game last year, and 0.19 this year. So he has that in him to repeat that goal number, and then 0.86 point per game last year is elite for a non-power play quarterback. So if your league does not favor power play points, then he's an excellent D2 or an elite D3 option, especially if your league has heavy goal weighting for a points league. Now, he averages under a hit per game and 1.28 blocks per game, so nothing targetable there, but he will score you goals if that's what you're looking for. Now, Drew Doughty is a power play quarterback, and when he was healthy last year, he was very productive. So 0.17 goal per game average, that's 14 goal pace, 0.79 point per game average, 0.33 power play points per game, and he added some hits and blocks as well, 1.5 hits and 1.3 blocks per game. So kind of does a little bit of everything, and those power play numbers are very good where they're at right now. And he's been trending in the right direction over the last few years as LA has become more competitive again. So I'd look for him to repeat that pace that he was on last year and could be a sneaky D3 option for you if you can get him. Currently, he's at ADP 79.1, which puts him at more of a D2 in terms of his draft position if you've pushed back your defense to the later rounds. So if you're D2, you've waited on him, it might be better to go with Doughty just because of the power play numbers and the hits and blocks coverage as well. Now, the next guy on this list is where it gets a little tricky. So Mackenzie Weegar is the next in terms of ADP, and he's been mentioned in the comments section of my hits and blocks video as a potential target, and that is true. He's just not, there's a little bit of a different, factor in terms of why you'd choose him over some of the other guys. So let's take a look at the guys that were mentioned in that video and compare them. So I added Jacob Trouba to the hits and blocks D at the bottom. Nurse is in this range, and we'll talk about him in this little graphic here. But Trouba, he might be the best value of the bunch, going at ADP 107.6 in the 9th round. He will get you some goal coverage. He gets you elite blocks coverage, the best of the bunch there. Excellent plus minus at plus 25, still gets 2.55 hits per game. If you combine these two metrics, he was 3rd in the league last year for hits and blocks coverage. Nurse was 5th. So they both get really good coverage there. When you compare these three defensemen, they're all very similar in terms of their category coverage. As you can see here, I just mentioned Trouba leads in goals and blocks. Nurse leads in shots, and none of these guys are power play guys, which is why they're in this range. But, Nurse had a little bit more time on the power play and got the numbers slightly higher. And then his hits coverage is pretty good, along with his plus 18. As you can see here, Weegar is the more offensive option. So 36 assists, 44 points, and a plus 40. Now, a lot of that was dependent on Florida's offense being so good, and they were really that good. Now, it's a little bit different as he's going over to Calgary. It's difficult to project what's going to happen. Will he quarterback that power play unit? I'd lean towards Anderson as the power play quarterback in Calgary because last year with Anderson as the quarterback, they ranked 10th in the league on the power play. And Anderson had a higher point per game number with a 0.60 and a higher power play number at a 0.23 per game average for 19 power play points. Now, it's worth mentioning that, despite these numbers being put up in Florida, he will still have Huberdeau on his team. If he gets the power play time, Huberdeau will be on that unit. So, these numbers may not drop as much as you would initially expect. I just don't see that plus 40 holding up in Calgary, despite the fact that they are a good defensive team. But it is difficult to project just based on the moving parts, the fact that he's moved over to Calgary. These two are safer options because they're both with their same D pairs from last year. They're both, trying to, repeat the same exact thing that they did last year. And they have, the same pieces in place for Trouba, for Nurse. The offense is, largely the same. And there's still going to be guys that hit and block shots. So of these guys, I would say these two are safer options. And Weegar is currently the highest ADP guy of the bunch. Now, Weegar is being overdrafted, in my opinion, at ADP 81 in the 7th round. For what you get out of him, he does get you good point coverage if you're looking at last year's totals and the plus minus. He does cover these categories pretty well. The shot numbers are fine. There's nothing bad about his file. But at 81, you're missing out on some of the other elite guys in the 7th round that you could get that have a higher upside. Whereas with Nurse at ADP 98.6 in the 9th round, that could be better value if you want these categories and you just kind of want to fade that a little bit. If you want to fade it even more, Trouba at ADP 107 in the 9th round might actually be the best value play of the group. So again, it depends on your league format, what you're looking for, but if you're looking for hits, blocks, and some offensive production on top of that, these are the guys to look at. Jacob Trouba finished, I believe, in the top 70 overall in terms of Yahoo rank last year, and Nurse was in the top 90. Weegar was right around that. He's definitely ownable last year. Not exactly sure where he ended up at the end of the season, but he was still relatively prolific for these category coverages as well. Now, back at the list, I've covered the Theodore Pietrangelo files in a different video. Whichever one gets more PP1 time would likely be the target there, and mainly because their files are so similar and the power play time would be the determining factor. But Theodore covers goals a bit more at 0.179 goal per game, 14 goal pace, 0.66 points per game. He was a +6 last year, 2.62 shots, 0.15 power play points per game, hardly any hits, and 1.24 blocks per game. Pietrangelo, almost identical, 0.16 goal per game, 0.55 point per game, 2.83 shots, so a little bit more shot coverage there. Almost identical power play numbers, 0.16 power play points per game, and twice as many hits at 0.825. Nothing crazy there, but double the amount of hits, and then 2.05 blocks per game, so the better block option as well. Just depends on the power play time and what categories you're trying to cover with this pick. Now, with the next guy on this list, Zach Werenski is a power play quarterback for an improved Columbus team. And last year he was third amongst defensemen in shot volume. So 3.17 shots per game, 0.16 goal per game, similar to the Vegas D. Higher point per game last year at a 0.70, slightly better power play numbers at a 0.20, 1.39 blocks per game, nothing crazy there, but the elite shot volume and goal potential. So his 5-year high for goals was a 0.31 goal per game, good for 20 goals in 63 games, or 25 goal pace over 82, which would have ranked him second last year. So that's his ceiling. That's what you're banking on, the shot and goal production out of Zach Werenski. We already mentioned Darnell Nurse, so I'll just skip to Brent Burns. I did want to mention him very quickly. Similar in terms of all the other guys in terms of category coverage, 1.82 blocks per game may be targetable. But the main reason I have him here is for his previous shot volume and power play numbers when San Jose was competitive. So during those years, 4.04 shots per game, 3.65 shots per game, 3.21 shots per game. And those numbers would be in the top 10 in the league depending on the year. So he's coming to a team that likes to get shot volume. The Canes were 9th in total shots last year. The previous season, they were 4th in shots per game. So if Burns can be above that 3 shot per game number this year, that will also improve on his plus minus, just the fact that he's on a better team. And if his power play numbers can come back to where they were. So he used to be a 0.32, 0.34, 0.24 type of guy in terms of power play points per game. It's dipped because of the lack of talent in San Jose. A fresh start could potentially jumpstart him in the right direction, and he could be great value for your D3 at ADP 98.3 in the 9th round. But the safest play may be Torrey Krug at ADP 104 in the 9th round. The reasoning here isn't based on last year's data, which does factor in some injury time and battling back from that injury, but his usual range is a 0.74 point per game 5-year average, which is very solid, 0.14 goal per game, mid-2 shot per game range, and his best seasons in Boston, the power play numbers were extremely good, 0.46 and 0.45 power play points per game, good for 30 and 28 power play points respectively. And then last year, St. Louis was third best offensive team and third best power play, 3.77 goals per game and 30.77% on the power play. And with Krug now healthy, there's already some upside baked into his file, considering where he's being drafted. So he's the much safer option just because nothing has changed. He's not going to a new team, and they are a very good offense and a good power play. But there are other options you could go for if you're looking for a D3. So let's look at some of the higher risk options. And on this list, you'll see a lot of younger D. So Rasmus Dahlin, Noah Dobson, Miro Heiskanen, Evan Bouchard, Thomas Chabot, all of whom have the potential and upside to do great things for your team. They all quarterback a power play, except for maybe Bouchard, depending on how that plays out in training camp. And their teams are in kind of different states. So Buffalo trying to become more competitive. The Islanders looking for more offense and trying to bounce back from last year. Heiskanen now quarterbacking the Dallas power play is interesting. Bouchard trying to grab some PP time away from Barry. And Thomas Chabot looking for that breakout season with a mid-pack defense at best. But each of these files contains some element of risk, and that's why they're listed here. The upside is why you would target them. As far as the other guys on this list are concerned, Hamilton is excellent for shot volume, and his power play numbers should improve this year, along with everything else in his file, as he was just battling injury last year and never quite got his feet underneath him in year one with the Devils. But the risk is plus minus in health, but the shot volume could be huge for you if you need that coverage around ADP 103.7 in the 9th round. So the only comparable shot volume D was Werenski at ADP 98.6, and they had identical 3.17 shots per game numbers last year, which was the same as Hamilton, but with Hamilton's ceiling being more in that 3.6 shots per game range. So he would be a shot target guy. If you're looking for goals in this range, then Justin Falk would be your guy. 16 goals last year. His points, 0.6 point per game range, shots 2.19 shots per game range are ownable, but not necessarily targets for him. But his hits and blocks production, 1.96 hits per game, 1.32 blocks per game, that could be targetable alongside his goal production. The reason he's in this range is that I fully expect Krug to take that power play one time off of Justin Falk, but he could still repeat his goal production with that stacked top 9 in St. Louis. Now, next to him, John Klingberg going to Anaheim. He will likely be the PP guy, and his PP numbers are good, hovering around that 0.30 per game number over the last 5 seasons. But other than that, and maybe assists, there's no other reason to draft him. No category coverage. Minus 28 last year on a good Dallas defense. I could see that getting worse in Anaheim. 1.87 shots per game is not great. No hits or blocks coverage to make note of, and the goal production isn't exceptional either, so pretty much just a power play guy. But if you're okay with increased risk, the reward may be there for a guy like Tony DeAngelo. So right now he's at ADP 121.3 in the 10th round, 0.79 point per game last year, so really good there. 0.15 goal per game last year for 10 goals. 0.22 goals per game the previous year for an 18-goal pace. That's some good goal production if you can get that out of him this year. 2.35 shots per game is good, but the 0.31 and the 0.27 power play points per game in the last 2 years would be the reason to target him. And those numbers were with Carolina, but he will be the guy in Philly. So, here's to hoping that he's on his best behavior with Torts running the ship and probably not going to take any of his BS. But the upside is certainly there, and his ADP leaves him, as relative value in that range. It's just a decent amount of risk to that file. Now, speaking of risk, Charlie McAvoy is a guy I've targeted in several mock drafts, and if you're going to do the same, it depends on your league settings and your format. So if you only have one IR spot, you have to choose between a couple of guys that you might want to stash. McAvoy, Marchand, Pacioretty, Bertuzzi, Besser, Tom Wilson, any number of guys not healthy to start the year. You'd have to pick which one of them if you only have one IR spot. If you have multiple, then he's definitely a guy you'd like to target as your D3 because he's similar to Nurse, Trouba, and Weegar in that he covers many categories well, but none of them at an elite level. So 1.98 hits per game, 1.65 blocks per game make him an option there. And then when you combine those with a 0.71 point per game last year, 10 goals, 0.26 power play points per game for 21 on the season. That's a bit safer in general than most of these other options if you can stomach the 2 months without him. He would potentially make an excellent D3 at ADP 135.8 in the 12th round, which is a significant discount compared to the rest of this tier. So a lot of these guys are, you're starting out in the 70 range, going into the 80 range, into the 90 range, and then as you go further out, McAvoy at 135.8 could be an excellent stash option. Now, with the D4, again, this depends on league format. My league has hits and blocks, and therefore these are the targets here. If your league doesn't have blocks and instead has plus minus, these guys are all still hits targets, but maybe you look at a guy like Gustav Forsling or a higher plus minus option, or perhaps you're looking at different category coverage as well. This list for this range is essentially the hits and blocks combined metric that I've talked about in a previous video, with the exception of Darnell Nurse, who I mentioned before, would have been in this range, the 5th guy. But yeah, it's in this order. So these are the hits blocks leaders as you go from left to right. So I'll just run through the names really quick. If you're not familiar with these guys, you have Radko Gudas, Rasmus Ristolainen, Jacob Trouba, Alex Romanov, now with the New York Islanders. You have Joel Edmondson. You have Adam Larson, Jani Hakanpää, Mario Ferraro, and David Savard. Several of these guys will go undrafted in your 12-team leagues. Gudis will likely go before his current ADP of 137.7 in the 12th round. I'd look to start targeting him in the 10th round range, or maybe even earlier if he's the centerpiece of your hits and blocks strategy, as I mentioned before. In my league last year, he went in the 90 range just because he is that elite guy and he does get the coverage there. So as we're looking, I don't know why that just jumped like that, but so to summarize all this, you need to tailor your defenseman strategy and plan around your league format. So if your league has plus minus, then you'll adapt the D4 strategy to that, and that will change some of these options. If you have a heavy weighting in your points league for shots and blocks, maybe hits, that completely changes your strategy for D2 to D4 or 5. It all depends on what you need. Now, if you're in a head-to-head categories league like myself with blocks instead of plus minus, the tiers look like that. And there were players I would have added to those tiers if I had the space to do so. I didn't cover everybody, but that gives you a general sense when ranked by the ADP. But that will do it for today's video. Thank God hockey is back and training camps are underway, which will give us some more insight into potential lineups, power play quarterbacks for this purpose, as well as line combinations for forwards. And just a quick note, after watching the Rangers-Islanders game last night, Keandre Miller looking sneaky good, could be due for a huge offensive increase this season. Just looks like one of the most smooth and powerful skaters on the ice again. But I wanted to thank you all for watching all the way through till the end, and I will see you in the next one.